All right. We have made it to the final session. I don't know if it's like I'm not trying to say that like this is like a journey or like a mission we were on to get to the end, but I appreciate all of you staying. I think we kept almost 70% of the crowd. Pretty good. It's not bad for a Sunday afternoon. So our final presentation from Ms. Timbra. Thank you, Greg. Pretty heavy topic to end the day. So hopefully this will, at the very end, that's always a big ask for an instructor. It's the last session to hold everyone's attention. So I'm sure she'll do it. So Ms. Timbra, take it away, please.
Well, I think you saved the best for last. At least that's my opinion. So my name is Timbra Burrup, and I currently live in Ontario, or I live in Idaho, but I work in Ontario, Oregon. I'd like to first of all thank you for allowing me to present this topic at your conference. I'm extremely excited to be here. So I've worked as an emergency nurse at St. Alphonsus in Ontario for the past 18 years. And now I'm currently the trauma coordinator there. In 2019, I obtained my master's in nursing education, and my thesis was on the lack of healthcare professional knowledge about human trafficking and the discrepancies about awareness and intervention. And so since that time, I have tried to talk to anyone I can about this topic. I think it's so important to hear, as we are the population that sees these victims during their time being trafficked. I promise I'll keep this short and sweet, so let's get started.
Hey, Timbra?
Yeah.
Can you give me about a 2-second pause? We're having an audio issue on this end. So give me just
sure.
a minute or two. So just a second.
No problem.
All right, we'll try it again. Go ahead.
Did you guys hear anything that I said?
Yes, we're just having issues with our speakers on this end.
Okay. So there, trying to make my presentation go. So human trafficking, it's a $150 billion global industry, which is a grave public health concern. There are an estimated 25 million victims to be involved. 16 million of them are in the forced labor sector, and almost 5 million of them are in the forced sexual exploitation. There is not a way to accurately count the number of people involved in trafficking, with the secretive and elusive culture that drives the victims to be hidden in plain sight. Human trafficking officially became a crime in 2000 with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which continues to be adjusted with the knowledge and insight that's gained each year into the practice of trafficking. Human trafficking has nothing to do with moving someone or someone from one country to another. That's the definition of smuggling. And smuggling is a crime against a border, not a person. Human trafficking can occur in people's own homes. So the legal definition for human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion must be present for a situation to be trafficking, and that force, fraud, or coercion must be the factor that propels the person to remain in that situation. So if you hire someone and promise to pay a certain amount and then renege on that promise, it's called fraud. If that person you cheated is free to leave and go file a complaint, it is not trafficking. It may be exploitation, but not trafficking. So this situation only becomes trafficking when a defrauded person is, for example, threatened with deportation for complaining. The only exception to that definition is when children become involved. Any child involved in any sexual activity is considered a felony, and there is no such thing under federal law as a child prostitute. So there are two types of human trafficking. Labor trafficking, as I said, has the most victims, but probably the least talked about. These are some of the industries where labor trafficking can occur. And coming from a rural area like I do, labor trafficking is something that we've tried to address through our task force. And some of the most common tactics for labor trafficking are the use of force. So their boss carries a gun when they watch them work. Fraud, you're lying about your work conditions or you're making false promises. Coercion, the crew leader threatened to call ICE if I leave, or I was afraid of what I would do to my family if I said anything. The ongoing debt is a large factor with labor trafficking. So the crew leader takes a part of their check each week to pay off their debt that never gets repaid. They're denied medical care, even when poor practices can affect them, such as spraying pests, not allowing them to leave the fields when pesticides are sprayed. They have controlled communication. They're only allowed to talk to certain people. Their movement is controlled. They're not able to go and leave as they please. And they're also, access to food is controlled. They're not allowed to take lunch breaks. They're not allowed to go to the store. So one of the prime examples of labor trafficking would be a diplomat who entices someone from their home country with an offer to come to the US and care for their children. They promise the worker a good wage and the opportunity for her to go to school. The diplomat repeatedly tells the worker how lucky she is for the opportunity and that she would never get this at home. If she returns home without having completed the job, she will be ashamed because so many people in her country are desperate for work. So when she gets to the US, the worker is told she'll sleep in a closet and she's also responsible for keeping up the house and yard, along with making and serving all the meals. Her passport's taken. She's told she can't leave the house without permission. When she complains, the employer threatens her family in her home country and says she'll call ICE and have the worker arrested for being here illegally. I can't imagine what a more devastating state that would be to be in. And on the flip side, sex trafficking, it's the most talked about form of human trafficking, but it's not something that you can see happening across a crowded room. It's not a crime that occurs in an instant, like a kidnapping or carjacking that a bystander can witness and report. In fact, many people in active sex trafficking situations don't recognize themselves as being victims because they've been expertly groomed by a trafficker to believe that they've chosen to participate in this commercial sex. And not all commercial sex is trafficking. So there are adults who choose to make a living in the sex trades, but it's important to remember that choice exists on that spectrum. For example, there are many people who choose to make a living selling sex because there are no good options available for them, but they have the choice to leave. And human trafficking can happen in any business. You can see these are the most highly used as sex trafficking, but it can also happen at home. It can also happen within families. And so who are the traffickers? So there's not a physical description that you can give for what a trafficker looks like. They can be an individual who seeks a mail order bride or a lone pimp attempting to gain another resource. They can work in an organized fashion with multiple levels of involvement. And one example being a young girl who's forced to recruit her friends and other girls or boys into this lifestyle by her pimp, who will then send him to his higher ups and be distributed, sometimes across the country or sometimes internationally. And online recruitment is a profitable way to gain an intended victim. An example would be a lonely, insecure teen who dreams of a modeling career and frequently posts pictures of herself striking a pose. She is contacted by someone who claims to be a modeling agent and sends her a plane ticket to come to his studio. When she arrives, he takes her out on the town and tells her he has to, quote, unquote, be nice to some people in the business to get contacts, and sends her out to prostitute. She is far from home. She didn't tell her parents she was leaving. She has no money, and now she's so ashamed. He tells her that she has to make a good impression and that it will just take a little longer for her hard work to turn into a modeling job. And we've all heard the stories of the flight attendants who stopped these young girls from trafficking across the country for this promise alone. I can tell you that it's happening every day. So you have traffickers and you have the victims being trafficked. And unfortunately, probably the most predominant group are the runaway, homeless youth, or foster children. And they are preyed upon because they are extremely vulnerable and naive. In the US, children between ages of 11 and 14 are often recruited through social media and internet. I have 3 kids. I have a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old, and I see how active they are online. They don't have social media, but they're still there. I can see how easy that would happen. And sadly, many child trafficking victims are introduced into the lifestyle by their family. And something that was very hard to read about in the literature I did for my thesis, but oftentimes it's a drug addict parent who offers her children to her drug dealer as payment. And then, so these young children are indoctrinated into this cycle. When they finally break free, they're viewed as a delinquent instead of a victim. They're placed right back in the scenario that positioned them into trafficking in the first place, whether that be with their families or their foster parents. So you can see how that cycle just perpetuates, keeps going. And so the next slide, let's talk about the vulnerabilities that the trafficked victim possesses. So we talked about the homeless, the runaway. The LGBTQ plus community is a very large population. In fact, 39% of the youth trafficked fall into this category. 1 in 6 homeless youth are sex trafficked, and 1 in 3 homeless youths have engaged in survival sex, meaning selling themselves for a place to live or food or money, not being controlled by someone else. And what a sad statistic that it takes on average 48 hours after these kids run away before they're in contact with the trafficker. So there are no specific means. There are very specific means that traffickers use to recruit their victims that we'll talk about in the next slide. But it can happen to anyone, any group, any individual. No one, unfortunately, is safe. And if you look at these, you can see a lot of these vulnerabilities are the same as some of the community vulnerabilities that I'll talk about here in just a second. But they're kind of endemic in the rural landscape that I live in, and many of you probably live in as well. So these are probably the most talked about recruitment strategies. Probably the boyfriend or the Romeo pimper is the most romanticized in literature or TV or movies. That's the trafficker who becomes a boyfriend with someone and then takes them away from their situation and forces them into prostituting or escorting. You can have the bait and switch, so an employer, that's more labor trafficking, but it can also be for dancing, modeling, escorting. The friend, which, like we talked about, the young girl who is a traffic victim recruits her friends to be in that lifestyle as well. So trafficking is not the example seen on the movie Taken, where a young girl is abducted and then her father uses his specific skills to get her back. So trafficking is much more subtle. And sadly, when you think about trafficking, the trafficker puts a lot of time up front gaining the victim's trust and then slowly steers them towards the end goal of being his useless or useful commodity. So trafficking victims are commodities that can be used over and over and over again. If you're a drug dealer, you just have to show up and get your drugs and then you distribute your product, but you just keep doing that over and over and over. But with human trafficking, once you've got your victim coerced or forced, you don't have to put any more effort into their recruitment. So these victims are used over and over and over again, and if they're not useful, they are threatened with violence. Their families, their friends, or they're put in answering the phones for the escort service. They're put to work somehow. So communities just as well as victims can be vulnerable to trafficking. And I don't know about you, but each of these vulnerabilities are present in the area I live in. We have a large interstate and many high traffic highways in our area, along with many truck stops and hotels near the interstate. In the task force that I work with in Eastern Oregon, we frequent hotels as that's where the victims that we're encountering are saying that the trafficking is happening. The hotel workers are very naive, saying that that's not true, but the victims are telling us that's exactly where it's happening. In talking to community members in our area, they're shocked that we have even helped any trafficking victims, which perpetuates the idea that trafficking only occurs in large cities. Malheur County, where I'm from, is also the poorest county in Oregon with a significant high unemployment rate. Probably the biggest one, and my reason for being here is the lack of training for healthcare professionals is also a community vulnerability. If you're not trained to what to look for and how to intervene, these victims are just going to get used again and again. So nationwide hotspots for trafficking, they exhibit a pattern based on infrastructure. So the picture on the right is the nationwide view. You can see the East Coast along with Florida, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, as well as the West Coast with California and our own I-5 corridor on the left. You can almost follow along the freeway up to Seattle and across to Portland by looking at this map. And the area that I'm from right here, that little yellow orange dot right there is it's our own little area. So why I'm here today. So what healthcare providers need to know. So healthcare, we are the one population that interacts with these victims outside of their circle. From pre-hospital to urgent cares to emergency departments to OB/GYN clinics, we are the people who are seeing them. In reviewing medical literature, it's evident that healthcare professionals are not taught this subject, nor how to interact with the victims. Also shown is that education is an effective tool for awareness and intervention on their behalf. So like I've talked about, victims are considered a commodity. The traffickers don't care what their clients do to this their product. And the traffickers, they want to maximize their product. So these victims have no preventative health care, no vaccines, no dental care. They have no health insurance. There's no attention to safety. Any attempts at unprofessional or unsanitary medical fixes focus on continuing production rather than health. And the lack of compliance with treatment or follow-up care is huge with this population. So what can we do? So it's called SOAR, Stop, Observe, Ask, and Respond. So you can find trainings from the Department of Human Services, the Oregon Department of Justice, the Polaris Project, all online dealing with human trafficking. But what do you do in your day-to-day world when you think you've encountered a human trafficking victim? So let's go through a scenario. So you're working the overnight hours when dispatch sends you to a local motel for a patient with an altered mental status. This motel is a high foot traffic area along the border of your city. A young female is inside the hotel room who appears to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. She cannot keep her eyes opened and is slumped against the headboard of the bed. The motel room appears to be in disarray, has several trash bags which appear to have clothing in them, as well as 2 other females and 2 other males. One male claimed that he is friends with the female and that she may have partied too hard. No one in the hotel room knew her name other than to call her Broadway. As you transport the female to a local hospital, you administer Narcan as the patient begins to wake and is immediately scared and nervous. The victim had no identification on her. The patient then tries to get out of the ambulance saying, "I have to get back now. Please take me back, please." Attempts of reassuring her do not work as you pull into the local emergency room. Inside the ER, nurses are familiar with your victim as a frequent flyer who always asks to be discharged with pain medication. They identified her as a 16-year-old female who had multiple encounters with social services. She usually signed out against medical advice, and a group of males picks her up out front of the ER. Your EMS crew cleared the ER and continued your shift. As you drive home in the morning, something continued to eat you about that patient from the hotel. It did not seem right, but you did not know who to call. Should you get involved? So some of the red flags that you saw were multiple people in the room, no one knew her name, no identification. I can't imagine how many countless times you have all gone out and given someone Narcan and they immediately start fighting you or try to get out of the ambulance. I mean, that's just a day-to-day call. But in the back of your mind, be thinking, are they not wanting to be somewhere that their trafficker won't let them? The unusual attachment to cell phones or multiple phones. I joke that that's my teenagers, but it's not. they truly can't live without their phone because they don't know where to go next, or if the trafficker can't get a hold of them, they're usually beaten. Signs of psychological distress, hypervigilance, nervousness, or paranoid. That's almost every person on meth as well, but drug use and trafficking go hand in hand. So keep that in the back of your mind the next time you have a drug addict as well. Any sign of physical trauma, I mean, that's a big one, but probably the two most important are inappropriate dress related to weather condition or locale. So in our area, it would be the two young females with the older male in Walmart in the middle of January with short skirts on and heels. Like, that just doesn't fit our area. And the thing we see in the ER predominantly with human trafficking, domestic violence, is that controlling person or dominating person who answers all of their questions. It's the man who stands with his arms crossed and won't let the female or male answer any question. Nothing is answered except for by this person. So any of those things need to be red flags that you need to be asking some certain questions. And so what are we asking? So we're trying to get these victims alone. We're trying to do it in the most discreet manner possible. I can tell you that I've followed patients down to x-ray knowing that their controlling person with them wouldn't be allowed in x-ray with them. So you're trying to ask them questions such as, how did you get here? Where do you live? What type of labor services do you do? How long have you been working there? Do you get paid? Has your family been threatened? Is someone keeping your legal documents? Have you or anyone you work with been abused? Do you owe anyone money? And are you allowed to leave freely? Now, those questions seem kind of strange to be asking for pre-hospital care, but if you're able to establish a rapport with that victim, those questions are invaluable for the healthcare moving forward. So you can document these in your chart. They can be used by future law enforcement who are investigating the crimes. These victims are likely to be very distrustful of public safety workers. Therefore, they may not admit that they're victims and they may not ask for help. Their communication can seem scripted or very vague. That's what they've been told to answer. The conversation can be normalized by saying, these questions that I'm going to ask you are questions that I ask all of my patients. You don't have to answer these questions that you're not comfortable with answering. The victim should not be asked to repeat his or her story to multiple people, as detailed or unnecessary further discussion can be traumatizing. Hence the important communication with hospital staff. Provide that detailed report to the emergency room staff, as further probing may cause the victim to shut down and not want to speak at all. So victims may exhibit signs of physical or sexual abuse. They may have general indicators of trafficking, such as being fearful of the police, fearful of the trafficker. They don't want to tell anyone their situation. They're unaware of where they are or where they've been moved, as multiple times they're getting moved. So victims may constantly try to text their trafficker to let him or her know where he or she is. Be careful, the trafficker may be a family member or identified as a significant other. This trafficker may only have one traffic victim or may have several. Ensure patient care is a priority. Continue to advocate for the victim throughout your care, and if the victim does not want to provide answers, document that accordingly and follow up with law enforcement or one of the resources listed that we'll discuss. So you're responding. So in that scenario before, despite how the victim answers your questions or admits to being a victim, continue to build rapport and trust so that the victim will feel that EMS and healthcare is an environment to which they can safely return in the future. Many victims will not be interested in leaving their current situation due to fear and mistrust, but may be willing to accept resources or return later if they are assured that calling for EMS or entering the healthcare system is safe for them. So the number of the National Human Trafficking Hotline can be provided to the victim on a small piece of paper, preferably discreetly, without any identification. So I've written that number on multiple people's discharge instructions without a word, just the number, letting that person know that that's what that number is. So in situations of immediate life-threatening danger, follow your policy for contacting law enforcement. Whenever possible, make an effort with the patient in that decision to contact law enforcement as not to lose their trust or rapport. So knowing what resources you have around you can benefit this population immensely. So this picture with the little flags are all of the task forces in Oregon associated with the Department of Justice. So you have Lynn, Benton County, Clackamas, Deschutes, Douglas, Jackson, Klamath, Lane, Lincoln, Marion, Multnomah, Washington, multiple Mid-Columbia task forces up here. And then right here is TCAT, which is the Tri-County Anti-Trafficking Task Force, and that's what I'm a member of. We are Oregon and Idaho, so we're Mount Hear County and we're Payette and we're Washington County in Idaho. Some of these task forces can provide shelter, they can provide immediate shelter, they can provide clothing, they can provide mental health or medical services, they can provide counseling, they can take them to the dentist. Some of them have ties to large networks that are in place to help these victims. So at TCAT in Eastern Oregon, we partnered with Project Dove, which is our domestic violence group in this area, and they refer any human trafficking victim to us. And then we have built a partnership with Cobb's in Idaho, which has 3 or 4 safe houses that these victims can go to. So just by networking and knowing where you can send these patients will be a huge benefit to them. And so in conclusion, I want to read you a little scenario of a human, one of the most respected and one of the biggest advocates for human trafficking education. She is a survivor. So I want to read you her little bio. So she grew up in a small lumber town. She was an average girl who had never been put in an at-risk youth category. She played varsity sports. She was on the honor roll and graduated a year early and accepted into a state university. The summer after graduation, she got pregnant and had to withdraw from her dorm room. She moved in with her parents and had a daughter, but kept moving forward. She enrolled in community college as a single mom, and after all of her friends had gone off to the university, moved out. Well, after all of her friends have gone out to the university, moved out of their dorm rooms, he invited her and her daughter to move in with them. And she was really excited to get out of her small town. So she realized very quickly, though, that the vulnerabilities that she had growing up, even in a quote unquote good home, were still there. Her parents divorced when she was young, and it was an ugly divorce. Her mom became a single mom, but by high school, things had started to turn around for her. When she went off to college and moved in with her friends, those same vulnerabilities had resurfaced. So while all of her friends were off doing what college kids do, she was the girl stuck at home with the kid until she met the most amazing man. He was funny and charming. He got to know her hopes, her dreams, and her fears. He slowly pushed the boundaries of hypersexuality in her life. And after 6 months of dating, he invited her to move in with him. See, trafficking is not always abductions. It's a slow, gradual expanse of boundaries and an increase of trust. The day that my daughter and I arrived in Las Vegas, which is where he moved us to, he forced me into human trafficking. For nearly 6 years, I was sold between 3 different traffickers. There were 3 other women in the home with us and 2 children. During that time, I was branded twice, having 2 men tattoo their names on my back like a piece of cattle. My face had been broken in 5 places. I was hospitalized for dehydration and overexhaustion. I had been to jail 7 times, but I was never kidnapped or duct taped or locked in a room with a dirty mattress. The reality is that my daughter may have gone to school with yours. I may have stood next to you in the grocery store, and no one ever noticed. No one ever noticed because we all envisioned that one day. I went through the thought of I got on the plane willingly. I got out of the car willingly. I didn't fully understand the complexities of force, fraud, and coercion played out in my life. It played out in my everyday life. Thankfully, mind you, in 2006, the federal investigators raided her home, and in 2007, allowed her and her daughter to eventually escape. But I can tell you that running was not the hard part. The hard part was choosing poverty. The hard part was starting over at 26 with an 8-year-old girl being homeless. The hard part was having a criminal record, a huge gap in job history, and more trauma than any person should live with. The hard part was, what now? So I escaped, but now the journey began to figure out how to navigate this new world of normalcy with the same vulnerabilities that got me trafficked in the first place. And that is an excerpt from Rebecca Bender's story. She grew up in a small lumber town right outside of Medford. It was Oregon State University that she got accepted to, but had to drop out. And it was Eugene that she moved in with her friends. Now, 2006 is when she was finally rescued. So I'm here to tell you that this has been a problem for a long time, and finally people are starting to talk about it. So here's that number. Have it in your rig, have it somewhere that you can easily give to any person you suspect of being a human trafficking victim. Sometimes that's all you can do. If you're able to build that rapport with them and get them interventions or get them away from that situation, obviously that's the best thing that could ever happen, but that doesn't always happen. So that's the end of my sad little spiel, but what questions do you guys have?
There's none in the room. No questions in the room anyway.
Good.
Can't see you on the monitor.
How do we find out how many places or how do we get in touch with safe houses if they may not be willing to call, they may be willing to talk to us, but they may not be willing to call?
This is for us to call, right? This is for us to call.
It's for us to call for them?
Yes.
Or
Right.
you can call and report it. You can call, or they can call and ask to get help. So they'll take either or. They'll take the report, the trafficking is happening at this location, or they will take the victim saying, I need help now.
On an average, how fast can you get a safe house?
How fast you get what?
How fast can you get somebody into a safe house?
Well, there's certain criteria that they have to meet to get into that safe house, but most of the time they have like a 24-hour emergency shelter place that they can go to that may not be associated with the safe house, because you have to build up to that. But they do, most of them have a place that these victims can go that will keep them safe. And that's when that therapeutic approach, the trauma-informed care, that's when all of that starts to help them get the help that they need.
I have a question. I heard that under the Trump administration, they were able to rescue the most human trafficking of any administration in our history. Do you have any facts on that?
You know, the Polaris Project is probably the best place to go for any data regarding human trafficking. You could get accurate data for who is helped, because those are actually being reported. As far as who are victims, you're never going to get an accurate number. So that may or may not be the case. I know that just with people talking about it and being more of a topic across every discipline, that more patients are getting help. So I would hope that there would have been the most victims helped during that time.
Thank you.
Are they still being marked, or like, that was listened to a presentation once, and I think like to help us out, they said, look for these marks, look for these either on their hand or neck.
Yeah, tattooing is real big with that population. A lot of like crowns or royalty, a lot of money, or a lot of names or acronyms of names. That's probably the biggest thing that they're tattooed with.
Timber, one of the questions online is, are people of color or minorities more likely to be trafficked?
Absolutely. People of color, indigenous people, and then the transgendered LGBTQ are the biggest population. And you can see how that kind of feeds in with the community and victim vulnerabilities in certain areas.
I have a question. So I've noticed a lot in the women's bathrooms, obviously, I don't know if it's ever in the men's bathrooms, but women's bathrooms in like restaurants, airports, there's a number in stalls for the human trafficking number. Has there been a direct link correlation of, hey, since we've been putting these numbers, we've been getting a lot more calls, or?
Did you hear that, Timber? So the question was, with the phone numbers going in female bathroom stalls, that's helping, we assume?
Yes. So that's with our task force, we're actually do what we call a purple ribbon butterfly. So we try to put these stickers with a 1-800 number to our local task force in all of the truck stop bathrooms, or in all of our medical services around the area. Just knowing that that's where these victims are frequented based on interviewing previous victims, that's why those are being targeted. And so the medical profession, we see the victims, but like the truck stops, the hotels, that's probably the second biggest place that sees these victims.
Any other questions? I see none online. All right, thank you, Timbra. I think that's
Yeah,
it.
no problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.